Tonight, I want to tell you the true story of who forged the first lightsaber, and why that act nearly killed the person who made it. It is a story I have found myself returning to, because it reads at first like a triumph of will and ingenuity, and becomes something else entirely the closer you hold it to the light. The lightsaber, as you know it, is the iconic weapon of the Jedi Order, a blade of plasma constrained in magnetic fields, burning at temperatures that can cut through almost anything, powered by a kyber crystal attuned to the wielder's connection to the Force. The Jedi believe they invented it. It is part of their foundational mythology, woven into how they understand themselves as peacekeepers and guardians. But that belief, comforting as it is not quite true. The truth is older and far more complicated, and it begins not with triumph, but with a discovery that should never have been made. In the restricted archives of the Jedi Temple, in a vault so deep that only the highest councils are permitted entry, there sits a saber unlike any other. It was found in the ruins of an ancient Sith stronghold during the early years of the Jedi Order by a scout whose name has been lost to time. What the scout found was not just an artifact, but a wound, a weapon that still hungered after thousands of years, still drew blood from anything that tried to wield it, and still sang in the Force with a note of terrible longing. You see, kyber crystals are alive in their way, resonant with the Force, responsive to the wielder who claims them. A Jedi and a crystal are tuned to each other. The crystal takes on the wielder's nature, their discipline, their light, and the blade emerges blue or green, steady and true. A Sith Lord and a crystal are at war with each other. The Sith pours rage and pain and hatred into the stone until it bleeds red, cracked and unstable, a weapon of fury. But this saber was neither. When it ignited, those who were near enough to witness it reported something that had no name in their records. A light that was wrong, that wavered between impossible colors, violet and silver, and something that might have been gold or might have been the ghost of starlight. And it burned its wielder. Not with heat, not in any way that made sense, but from within, as if the blade itself was drinking something essential from the person holding it. I find myself thinking about this a lot, because there is a particular kind of horror in a weapon that does not merely harm the enemy, but harms its own maker, its own wielder, as the price of its existence. Most weapons are simple. You forge them, you use them, they serve their purpose. This one was different. This one was alive, in a way that went beyond the natural resonance of a crystal with the Force. It had been made alive by an act of desperation and sacrifice, by someone who took the fundamental nature of what a kyber crystal is and twisted it into something new, something that should never have been created. The question that haunted the Jedi scholars who first studied it was simple enough on the surface. How was this done? But beneath that question lay something deeper. Why would anyone do it? What would drive someone to forge a weapon that consumed its wielder? What kind of desperation, or ambition, or dark understanding of the Force would lead to that moment? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if this weapon existed, if it was possible to create it, then what did that say about the nature of the lightsaber itself, the sacred weapon of the Jedi Order? If one had been made through suffering and alchemy, and a fundamental violation of the natural order, could that poison run deeper than anyone wished to acknowledge? The Jedi Council made a decision when they confronted these questions that would echo across millennia. They chose not to destroy the saber, though they could have. They chose not to study it openly, though parts of them desperately wanted to understand how it worked, what made it different, what secrets it held about the nature of kyber crystals and the Force. Instead, they sealed it away, along with the knowledge of its origin, behind layers of encryption and restricted access, in vaults meant to hold only the most dangerous truths. And they began, slowly and methodically, to build a different story. They began to teach that the lightsaber had always been a tool of the Jedi, that it was born from their discipline and their harmony with the Force, that it represented their philosophy and their light. It was not a lie, exactly, but it was incomplete, and incompleteness can be its own kind of deception. The deepest history of the lightsaber, its true origin, remained locked away. Over the next while, we are going to walk the whole of it together. How the weapon came to be forged in the deepest darkness of Sith territory, who made it and what drove her to do it, the cost she paid and the cost that was passed on to everyone who came after, how the knowledge was hidden and why it was hidden and what it means that it was. We will meet the architects of the original design, the Sith lords and alchemists who believed they were creating the ultimate tool for wielding the dark side of the Force. We will follow the path of the woman who became the first true wielder, who understood too late what her creation meant, and whose sacrifice became a secret the Jedi would keep for 10,000 years. And we will trace how that secret echoed forward through history, influencing the design of every lightsaber that came after, haunting the philosophy of the Order itself, until at last fragments of the truth began to surface in the late years of the Republic, just when it was far too late to change anything. So settle in, and let me take you back to a time long before the Jedi, long before the Republic, to an age when the Sith Empire was at its height, and the search for dominion over the Force itself was the only thing that mattered. Let me take you to the moment when someone decided that a kyber crystal was not enough, that mere alchemy was not enough, that what was needed was a weapon that could feed on the Force itself. Let me tell you how that hunger began, and why it will never truly end. 25,000 years before the stars aligned above Tatooine and a farm boy looked up at the twin sunset, there existed a people, not conquerors yet, but builders, mystics, already intimate with a power that would one day nearly unmake the galaxy. The Sith were red-skinned and native to a world called Korriban, a planet that orbited a dying sun, and they had learned, long before any robed order of peacekeepers rose on distant Archdu, that the Force could be bent to serve ambition. There is something I want you to understand about those early Sith, because it matters to what comes later. They were not inherently evil, not in the way we think of evil now. They were simply willing to ask questions the Jedi would later forbid. What if the Force could be made visible? What if its power could be held in your hand, channeled not through meditation and restraint, but through will, through hunger, through the unbending certainty that you deserved what you took? Somewhere in those first temples on Korriban, temples built not of light, but of stone that drank the darkness from the sky, Sith alchemists began to experiment with the ancient kyber crystals that grew in the planet's deep places. These were not weapons yet, you understand. They were something older. They were attempts to understand the Force as a thing that could be weaponized, shaped, subordinated to the will of those who understood its depths. The kyber crystal, as far as anyone has ever known, is a living thing in a sense that is difficult to articulate. It is Force-sensitive, attuned to the emotions and intentions of those who touch it, responsive in ways that seem almost conscious. The earliest Jedi, when they would later begin their own work with these crystals, would understand this as harmony, a collaboration between wielder and stone, a conversation conducted in the language of the Force itself. The Sith understood it differently. They saw in the kyber's sensitivity not a partner but a tool, and more than that, they saw in its resonance with the Force a possible instrument of domination. What the Sith pursued in those long centuries on Korriban was the weaponization of the Force itself, not a lightsaber as the Jedi would eventually know it, but something stranger, something alive in ways that neither side fully understood. They experimented with ritual and alchemy, pouring their rage, their hunger, their certainty of absolute power into the crystals, watching to see if the stones would transform, if the Force could be bent to amplify and channel what lived in the dark side. Some of these experiments succeeded in ways that were terrible. Some failed spectacularly, consuming the alchemist along with the materials. There is a record, fragmentary, contradictory, but persistent, of a Sith Lord named Momin, though whether he lived in this era or another is something scholars still argue about. who believed he could forge a weapon that would not simply channel the Force, but would resonate with it so perfectly that it would become a kind of extension of the wielder's will itself. I find myself thinking about the nature of that ambition, the certainty it required. To believe that power could be that complete, that absolute, that it could be held in an object and wielded without compromise. There is something both seductive and terrible in it. The Jedi, when they eventually encountered such ideas, would recoil from them not merely as evil, but as fundamentally contrary to the nature of the Force itself, which they understood as something that demanded balance, acceptance, surrender to a larger harmony. The Sith believed the opposite, that the Force was meant to be dominated, that its power was wasted on those too weak or too disciplined to use it. What happened on Korriban in those early centuries was not, then, a simple descent into darkness. It was a systematic hunt for a tool worthy of dark side mastery, something that would allow the wielder to channel raw emotion, raw hunger, raw power, without the dilution of mercy or restraint. The alchemists built chambers deep in the temples, places where the air itself seemed to hum with a kind of wrongness, and they brought kyber crystals to those chambers and sang to them in languages we no longer have names for, poured their intentions into them, watched to see if the stone would answer. Some crystals shattered under the weight of that attention. Some turned colors that had no precedent, deep reds like congealed blood, blacks that seemed to absorb light itself, purples that flickered as if caught between states. And some, I want you to understand this, some seem to develop an appetite. It is not a metaphor, or at least I do not believe it is one. The records that survive speak of crystals that, once activated, seem to draw energy from their surroundings, hungry in a way that suggested something beyond mere mechanical function. There were whispers of weapons that had to be fed, not with power cells or charging stations, but with the Force itself, pulling from the wielder's vitality, from the life force of their surroundings, from anything that radiated the resonance the crystal had come to crave. It is the kind of detail that gets recorded by the desperate or the mad, and perhaps there is no meaningful difference between those states when you are standing in a chamber deep in an ancient temple, watching your creation consume something you cannot fully name. By the time the first dark Jedi exiles would arrive on Korriban, centuries, perhaps millennia, after these initial experiments, the Sith had already been searching for nearly 10,000 years for a weapon that would transcend all others, a tool that would allow absolute mastery of the Force itself. They had not found it, not quite. But they had found something, a method, a ritual, a way of corrupting and binding a kyber crystal so that it could channel power far beyond the normal limitations of such stones. They had found, in other words, a way to make the Force bleed. And in doing so, they had created something unstable, something alive in ways that horrified even them. On the sealed archives of Korriban, in vaults beneath vaults, these weapons were kept. Broken things, dangerous things, prototypes of something that was never quite right, weapons that had consumed their makers or had to be entombed to prevent them from consuming everything around them. There is a particular kind of desperation that drives a civilization to create something it cannot control, in hope of a power it cannot attain. The Sith, in their hunger for absolute mastery, had created instead an appetite they could not satisfy, a weapon that wanted more than any wielder could give it. And in doing so, they had set something in motion that would echo across millennia, across the fall of empires, and the rise of orders meant to oppose everything they stood for, reaching at last into a hidden vault where a Jedi would one day discover something ancient and broken, something that still, after 25,000 years, hungered. I think about the alchemists sometimes, standing in those deep chambers, watching their work consume itself, understanding too late what they had made. There is a warning in that, if we have the courage to hear it. Deep beneath Korriban's obsidian surface, in chambers carved so far down that the rock itself seemed to pulse with a slow, dark breathing, the ancient Sith built their laboratories, not as places of reason, but as altars to domination itself. The stones in those caverns were older than memory, laid down when the planet was young, and the Force itself had not yet learned to distinguish between light and darkness. Above ground, the temples rose in spires that caught what little light the Sith sun offered. Below, the work happened in darkness, so complete it required no flame. The alchemists who worked there, and I want you to understand, these were not scientists in any way we might recognize. They were ritualists, practitioners of a discipline so ancient that its true origins had been lost even to the Sith themselves, moved through those black chambers as if in prayer. They had been given a commission that bordered on the theological. Take the crystals, the living Kyber stones that sang in the Force with a natural harmony, and remake them into something else. Something that would answer only to will, to hunger, to the dominion of the dark side. The Kyber crystals themselves were the problem, you see. A Jedi who approached one in the proper way, and we know now from their own records that they would go to places like the caves of Ilum, great caverns where the stones grew like luminous gardens, could hear them sing. Not metaphorically, the crystals resonated with the Force in a way that was almost a voice, a frequency that only a Force-sensitive could perceive. And when a Jedi reached out to one of these stones with intention and openness, something remarkable happened. The crystal would choose them back. There was a harmony in it, a mutual recognition, as if the stone had been waiting for that particular person all along. The Sith, as far as anyone has been able to piece together, could never replicate that. A Sith could take a Kyber crystal, could seize one, steal one, tear it from a Jedi's hands, but it would not sing for them. It would not choose them. That was an intolerable fact to people who built their entire philosophy around the supremacy of will. So they began to remake the crystals by force. The process that the ancient Sith alchemists developed. And here we are in deep canon, in the very foundational tech of the dark side, was called bleeding, though that word carries only a fraction of what actually happened. To bleed a Kyber crystal, a Sith would take the stone into a chamber, often alone, and they would pour themselves into it. Their rage, their hatred, their pain, their absolute refusal to accept any will but their own. They would pour all of this through the Force itself, not as a harmony, but as a domination, as an overpowering of the crystal's natural resonance. And the crystal, which was living and aware in its own way, would cry out. That is the language that has survived in the records. It cried out. Some accounts suggest that the sound was only in the Force, only perceptible to those who were bleeding the stone. Others insist that if you stood in those chambers at the moment of corruption, you could hear it as an actual sound, a kind of high, keening frequency that made your teeth ache. What happened when a Kyber crystal was bled was not destruction, exactly. The stone did not shatter or die. Instead, something like a breaking occurred, a domination of the crystal's will, a forcing of it into a new shape. Its color would change from whatever pale hue it had held, blue, green, clear, white, into red. A deep, bloody red, like light pouring through a wound. And once it had been bled, the crystal was changed forever. It would no longer answer to harmony, to openness, to that gentle call that a Jedi could make. It would answer only to the will that had broken it. There is something deeply unsettling in that transaction, I think. The idea that you could take something living and aware and force it into servitude to yourself through nothing but the intensity of your domination. It speaks to something fundamental about the dark side philosophy, that the only relationships that matter are those of complete subjugation. The ancient Sith alchemists in those caverns below Korriban became very good at bleeding crystals. They developed rituals, meditations, techniques that could accelerate the process or deepen the corruption. Ways to make the crystal not just servile, but eager to serve, to feed the hunger that their masters poured into it. They studied how different crystals responded to different kinds of pain, what wavelengths of the dark side produced the deepest corruption, how to stack ritual upon ritual to ensure that the bond between the Sith and the stone could never be broken. And what they created, over centuries of this work, were weapons that were not mere tools, but extensions of dark will itself. When a bled kyber crystal was mounted into a lightsaber and ignited, the blade that emerged was not stable in the way a naturally bonded crystal produced. The light of it was angry, seemed to flicker and rage, as if the blade itself resented its imprisonment in simple plasma. The wielder could feel it, the hunger in the weapon, the way it wanted to be fed, the sensation of the crystal's violated nature pushing against its bonds, always testing them, always threatening to burst free. I think what disturbed the Jedi most, when they eventually would learn of this, was not that the Sith had weapons that burned red instead of blue. It was that the weapons were alive, in a way theirs were not. Their own lightsabers were harmonies, partnerships, conversations with something beautiful. The Sith blades were enslaved things, screaming in the dark. But that knowledge was still far in the future. In those caverns beneath Korriban, the work continued. The alchemists bled their crystals and refined their techniques, and with each generation they pushed further, deeper, towards something they felt they were on the cusp of creating. Not merely a weapon of domination, but a weapon that could itself dominate, that could have its own hunger and its own will, that could feed on the Force in a way that would make it truly alive. They were trying to birth something that had never existed. They did not yet understand that what they were making would cost more than they were willing to pay. But the dark side rarely makes that clear at the beginning. It shows you only the power and saves the price for later. 12,000 years before the Skywalker saga, in the obsidian laboratories beneath Korriban, there was a Sith Lord who had begun to doubt everything his order had built. His name has been lost or deliberately erased, but we know him as the predecessor of Exar Kun, the Dark Master who would later reshape the Sith entirely. And in some ways, this forgotten figure was even more dangerous than his student, because he was the first to admit that the path they were walking was wrong. For centuries, the Sith alchemists had bled kyber crystals, had dominated them through ritual and dark side fury, had forced them into servitude until they glowed red and obedient. But obedient only until they were not. Every blade that came off the forges of Korriban carried something volatile, something that hungered in ways that grew harder to control the longer the weapon was wielded. The power cells would overheat. The cables that tethered these proto-sabers to their external packs would feed back dangerously if the crystal became too agitated. And worst of all, there were reports, quiet ones, shared only in the deepest vaults, that the weapons themselves seemed to develop something like preference, something like will. The Order's official position was that this instability was a weakness of technique, a failure of will on the part of the wielders. More power in the bleeding, more discipline in the binding, more absolute dominion over the stone. But this one Sith Lord, deep in his studies of the ancient texts, and the failed experiments stacked like corpses in the sealed chambers below the temples, had come to a different conclusion. He believed the problem was not that they were being too gentle with the crystals. He believed the problem was that they were treating them as objects to be dominated, when in fact they had become something else entirely, something that wanted to be shaped, that was calling out to be shaped if only someone would listen to it instead of trying to force it into silence. There is something profound in the moment when a man realizes his entire tradition is not just flawed but fundamentally backwards, and I find myself dwelling on what that realization must have felt like. The slow, cold terror of it, the isolation that follows, the knowledge that to speak this thought aloud is to position yourself against everything you have been taught to revere. He began to study the failures more carefully than anyone had before, the weapons that had burned themselves out, the wielders who had been consumed by feedback, the one experiment, whispered about in the oldest vaults, that had produced a blade so unstable it had to be sealed away completely and never spoken of again. And he noticed something that the rigid protocols had obscured. The most dangerous weapons were not the ones that had been bled the most aggressively, but rather the ones that had seemed to achieve some kind of alignment with their wielders, a symbiosis rather than a hierarchy. What if, he asked himself in the cold of those midnight hours, the answer was not to dominate the crystal more completely, but to surrender to it, to find a vessel willing to bond with the kyber so completely that the stone no longer had to be forced into submission, because it would be loved instead. It was heresy, and he knew it. The Sith Order had risen to power over the native Sith species by dominating them, had defeated the Jedi through superior will and absolute refusal to compromise, had built an entire civilization on the principle that the strong imposed their shape upon the weak and the yielding. To suggest that strength might instead lie in accepting the kyber's nature, in finding a willing partner rather than a conquered subject, was to strike at the very root of Sith philosophy. And yet he could not stop thinking about it. He began to speak carefully to the other alchemists, testing their thoughts, gauging their openness to doubt. Some turned away entirely, offended that he would even suggest such weakness. Others listened, and in their listening, he sensed a shared exhaustion with the endless failures, the endless refinement of techniques that were succeeding only in producing more elegant failures. What he proposed was something they had never attempted. Instead of a kyber crystal bound by ritual and dark side domination, they would seek a human vessel, a force-sensitive being, willing to become the container itself. The crystal would not be bled and forced into submission. It would be integrated into the wielder's own life force, their own spiritual essence, so completely that the distinction between weapon and user dissolved entirely. It was a dangerous idea, perhaps even a mad one, and he was careful in how he framed it, not as an abandonment of Sith principle, but as its apotheosis, the ultimate expression of the dark side's power, the creation of a being so completely fused with their weapon that the two could no longer be separated. In some ways, he was still a Sith, still arguing for dominion and control, still seeking absolute mastery. But he had glimpsed something else in the failures, in the sealed chambers, in the whisper of the crystal's hunger. That true mastery might mean ceasing to fight what you sought to control and instead becoming one with it. The proposal took root slowly, in the darkest corners of the laboratories, among the alchemists who had begun to doubt. They did not openly challenge the old paradigm. Instead, they simply began to prepare. They would need a vessel, a force-sensitive strong enough to survive the bonding, desperate enough to accept it, and willing to carry a burden that would destroy them. Finding such a person would not be difficult. The Outer Rim was full of those who had nothing left to lose. But that is a story that belongs to the next telling, because what matters now is understanding that the first lightsaber was not conceived in pride or triumph, but in a quiet rebellion against everything the Sith had believed about power, a heresy wrapped in the language of mastery, a surrender disguised as dominion, a question that should never have been asked. What if the crystal was not the thing to be controlled, but the wielder? Deep in the stone holdings of the ancient Sith territories, in chambers where the alchemists had long since learned to listen in a different way, there were places where kyber crystals still sang. Not the light, clear note of the caves on distant worlds, but something lower, something that made your teeth ache if you were open enough to hear it. She had never been told her name was worth keeping, so she didn't have one that mattered. The overseers called her by a number when they called her anything at all, and in the quiet places of the temple, she had learned to answer to the absence of a name as readily as to a voice. What made her different, what marked her from the first moment she could think, was that she could hear the stones speak to her in a language that had no words, the way you might feel someone's gaze on the back of your neck before you turned around, a kind of knowing that lived beneath speech. The Sith alchemists had noticed this, of course. They noticed everything about the Force-sensitive, the way trackers notice the spoor of a wounded animal, and they had brought her down into the deep places where the work happened, where the light of the upper world seemed to thin and stretch, and eventually stop altogether. She had understood, without being told, that she was not there to do work. She was there because she was the work, though what kind of work, what kind of making, she could not have said. The crystal they showed her on a day that might have been any day, For there were no days in the deep places. Only the endless thrumming of the Force through stone and bone was smaller than her closed hand, and it was the color of something between clear water and dying light. When she first heard it, truly heard it, not with her ears, but with that part of her that had always known how to listen to things that didn't speak, she understood why she had been brought down into the dark. The crystal was calling, and it had been calling for a long time, calling to something, and now, finally, something had come close enough to answer. There is a particular loneliness in being a vessel for something before you understand what it means to hold what fills you. And I think about her in that moment not as a sacrifice waiting to happen, but as someone encountering, for perhaps the first time, something that seemed to recognize her as real. In the holding chambers where she slept on stone with thin blankets that barely held any warmth, she found herself returning to the crystal again and again, drawn by something she did not recognize as her own willing, though it was. That was the terrible clarity of it, entirely her own. The overseers watched from the shadows, taking notes in the language of their science, recording how the Force sensitive's vitality seemed to shift when she was near the stone, how her presence appeared to calm the crystal's wild resonance, how something in the two seemed to be finding its harmony. She was not thinking about harmony or resonance or any of the words they used when they spoke about her as if she were not there. She was simply doing what the crystal asked, which was to sit with it, to listen to it, to let it listen to her, the way you might sit with someone dying and hold their hand without speaking, without needing to understand what the silence meant. Days accumulated, though she did not count them. There was only the descent into deeper listening, the way the crystal's song began to feel like her own blood in her veins, the way her breath began to time itself to the pulse of something that was not breath at all. In the Sith temples, whispers began. She could hear them echoing off stone even in the deepest places, that something unprecedented was occurring, that the bond forming between the vessel and the crystal was stronger than any forced attunement they had achieved before, that perhaps, finally, the radical proposal of the heretical Sith Lord had merit. What she felt, in the language of her own experience, was less like being chosen and more like being called home to a place she had never known she was far from. The crystal seemed to recognize in her an echo of its own nature, a hunger and a longing that had no words but made perfect sense in the dark. She did not know that kyber crystals are alive in the way that some living things are alive, aware, responsive, capable of drawing close to kindred presences. She only knew that she was no longer alone in the way she had always been alone. The other captives, kept in the upper holding areas where light still reached and where the Sith conducted their other experiments, would sometimes speak of freedom, of escape, of the world beyond the stone. She did not speak of these things, not because she no longer wanted them, but because the crystal's call had become a different kind of geography, and she was learning its landscape from the inside. When the chief alchemist came to observe her, a tall figure whose presence seemed to cut the air differently than other presences, whose mind you could feel pressing against the space around him like something too large to fit in a single body. She felt the crystal tense, and she understood, without knowing how she understood, that the stone was afraid. She did not know that you could be afraid for something else, that the capacity for that kind of love could begin in a slave who had been given nothing, trained in nothing, and yet here it was, moving through her like the crystal's own song, a fierce, protective instinct to keep safe the only thing that had ever treated her like something alive. The alchemist moved closer, and she interposed herself between him and the crystal, though she had no strength and no authority and no right to stand in anyone's way. And the simple fact of her doing it seemed to tell him something he wanted to know, something that made him nod slowly, as if a question he had been asking for a very long time had just received its answer. On a night when the stone seemed to resonate differently, when the crystal's song became almost unbearably clear, almost urgent, she felt it pulling at her in a way that was different from all the quiet calling that had come before, and she knew, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that something was about to change. She did not resist. She had learned, in the deep places, that resistance was a luxury for people whose lives were their own. and hers had belonged to the stone for longer than it had ever belonged to herself. The Sith alchemists, watching from their shadowed places, held their breath, because they knew they were about to witness what no one had ever witnessed before. The moment when a Force-sensitive and a kyber crystal would not simply attune to each other, as they might do in a cave somewhere on a distant world, but would bind completely, would fuse, would become something neither could be alone. And neither she nor they understood, in that moment, that they were about to build something that would not be a weapon in the way. A weapon is meant to be a tool, but rather a living thing with hunger and pain woven into its very nature, and that the cost of that hunger would be written in blood and light, and the slow, grinding diminishment of the only person who had ever cared whether she lived or died. In the chamber beneath the temple, on a night that nobody remembered afterward, because there was nothing left to remember it by, she knelt before the crystal and understood at last what she was meant to do. The stone had been calling to her for months, a song only she could hear, a voice that said, "You are real, you matter, I see you." And in that moment, she finally answered. Around her, the overseers watched in silence, their faces unreadable. They had prepared her for this, guided her to this threshold, and now they waited to see if the heresy their master had conceived would become truth. She reached out and touched the crystal, and the moment her skin met its surface, something in the Force shifted, a door opening that should have remained sealed. What happened next, I think, was not quite what anyone expected, though perhaps it should have been. The bond between a Force user and a kyber crystal is usually a dialogue, a gentle, mutual attunement, the wielder's consciousness brushing against the stone's resonance until they move together in harmony. This was not that. This was a merger so complete and so sudden that the boundary between her flesh and the crystal's lattice seemed to dissolve. She did not bond with the stone so much as begin to become it, her own life force flowing into its structure like water pouring into a vessel that had been empty for millennia. Her body convulsed, but not from pain, not yet. It was something closer to recognition, to the sensation of finally, impossibly, being whole. The crystal drank her in. And as it drank, it changed. The stone had been bled before, dominated and tortured by generations of Sith alchemists until its surface wept red. But this was different. This was not domination imposed from outside, but a willing gift, a lover's sacrifice rather than a slave's punishment. The red deepened, but it moved with purpose now, flowing like veins through the crystal's heart, and at its core something began to kindle. The first illumination was not violent. It was soft, almost tentative, a glow like candlelight, pale and uncertain, as if the weapon itself was afraid of what it was becoming. She gasped because she could feel it now, feel the blade forming in the space between her palms, feel the Force itself gathering and binding, compressing into a shape that the world had never quite seen before. The light grew steadier. The light grew brighter. And then it ignited. The blade that sprang into being was unlike anything the alchemists had imagined, because it was not a tool they had forged, but something alive, born from the willing fusion of a woman and a crystal, pulsing with an unstable luminescence that seemed to flicker and waver as if the blade itself was still learning how to burn. The color was not the clean red of a bled crystal or the harmonious blue of a Jedi attunement. It was something in between, something hungry, wavering between hues, as if the weapon could not quite decide what it wanted to be. She held it aloft, and her arms shook, not from weakness, but from the sheer sensation of it, the way the blade seemed to resonate with her own heartbeat, the way the Force that powered it felt like her own blood made luminous. For a moment, just a moment, it was perfect. For a moment, she understood what the overseers had promised, that she would be more than human, that the fusion would elevate her, make her something transcendent, a living weapon through which the Sith could wield power beyond measure. Then the hunger woke up. It started as a whisper, a small pulling sensation at the base of her skull, the way you might feel a thread tugging at your sleeve. But it deepened quickly. The blade's light began to pulse in sync with her breathing, and with each pulse, she felt something inside her give way, as if the weapon was not simply channeling her force. It was feeding on it, drawing not just the energy she could spare, but the essence of her, the life that made her real. She tried to lower the blade to break the bond, but her arms would not obey. The crystal had her now, and it held her with a tenderness that was somehow more terrible than any chains. The overseers did not move to help her. Perhaps they could not. Perhaps the chamber itself had become something other than a place they could navigate. Or perhaps they simply understood, as she was beginning to understand, that this was the price of creation, that the first weapon forged in this way would demand a cost written in blood and breath, and the slow dissolution of the one who had loved it into being. The blade burned on, steady and beautiful and utterly alive, and with each moment it burned brighter, the woman who held it felt herself becoming less, not weaker, but diminished, as if she were being slowly poured into the stone, as if the crystal was learning to be real by drinking what made her real. She did not scream. That was the thing that struck those who would later hear accounts of that night. She did not scream or rage or curse the choice she had made. She simply held the blade and wept, and the tears that fell from her eyes were clear, not red, and when they touched the blade they evaporated instantly, as if the weapon was so hungry it could not bear anything to fall outside its reach. In time, I do not know how long, perhaps minutes, perhaps hours, the overseers led her from the chamber, the blade still ignited in her hands, the light still pulsing with her heartbeat, still feeding, still taking. Behind them, the laboratory fell silent. The first lightsaber, the weapon that would reshape the galaxy, did not roar into being with triumph or fanfare. It emerged quietly in a moment of willing surrender, powered not by victorious mastery, but by a love so complete it became indistinguishable from sacrifice. And in the depths of what she had made, in the heart of the crystal that was no longer separate from her own heart, the hunger settled down to feast on what remained of the woman she had been. 3 days after the first ignition, she could no longer hide the tremor in her hands. The blade hung beside her in the darkness of the small chamber they had given her. Not a cell, not quite, but a space sealed from all eyes but the overseers who came to observe and take notes. It was beautiful still in that impossible way, the light wavering like breath, like something alive and struggling, and she understood now with a clarity that felt almost like grief that it was struggling because of her. She had expected pain, perhaps, or exhaustion, the normal toll of channeling the force through an external tool, even one as strange as this. What she had not expected was the hunger. It came in waves, not from the blade but from herself, as though her own body had become a kind of tuning fork vibrating at a frequency only the crystal understood. Every time she reached for the force, felt that familiar warmth move through her chest and into her arms, the blade seemed to drink it. Not consume it, not exactly. Drink, the way her own throat had drunk from the cisterns in the slave quarters, with a thirst that predated her and would outlive her. I find myself thinking about what she must have felt in those first hours, once the wonder had passed and the reality began to settle in. The crystal had called to her for so long, and she had answered, and now that answer was written in her blood. On the second night, during one of the meditation sessions, the overseers demanded to measure her, to watch for degradation. She ignited the blade deliberately. It was smaller than it had been the first time. She was almost certain of it. The light was slightly less bright, the hum less resonant. Afterward, her vision swam for a moment, and her fingertips had gone numb. When she pressed her palm against the wall of the chamber, she could feel how much colder her skin had become. The overseers noted it all with quiet satisfaction. They did not seem alarmed, and that was perhaps the most terrible thing of all, that this outcome was expected, that her slow dimming had been anticipated all along. She realized then, with a clarity that felt almost like drowning, that they had known what the blade would cost. They had always known. The heretical lord who had proposed living containment had spoken of unity, of a wielder and weapon becoming singular, of power that came not from domination, but from willing surrender. But surrender, she understood now, was only another word for consumption. The blade did not take, it took because she gave, and she gave because it asked, and it asked because asking was what it was. By the fourth day, she could barely lift the saber for more than a few minutes before her arm began to ache, as though the bone itself was cracking. She sat in the darkness and held the blade horizontally across her lap, watching the light bend and waver within the crystal's depths, looking for something like intention in that flicker. Was it aware of what it was doing to her? Was there consciousness in the hunger, or only appetite? There's a question I find echoing in all the records that come later. This question of whether the first blade was ever truly separate from its maker, or whether it was simply an expression of what she had become. Whether the hunger was something the blade possessed, or something that lived in her, and she had given it form. By the fifth day, she had lost weight enough that her bones showed sharp beneath her skin. Her hair, which had been dark, had begun to go grey at the temples, not the slow grey of age, but the sudden, shocked white of profound exhaustion. The overseers wanted her to use the blade again, to push it further, to test its limits, and she did what they asked because there was no power left in her to refuse. When she ignited it that time, the blade burned with a strange double light, wavering and hungry, and somehow more alive than it had been before, as though it were finally becoming itself. And in becoming itself, it took something from her that she knew, even as it was happening, she would not get back. The realization came not as terror, but as a kind of quiet acceptance. This was always the bargain, she understood now. The crystal had called to her not because she was worthy of wielding it, but because she was perfect fuel for it. A force-sensitive will, strong enough to bind the stone to consciousness, but not so strong that the binding would fail under the weight of what it would do to her. She had been chosen not as a master, but as a sacrifice, and the terrible thing was that she had chosen it too, had walked into the chamber willingly, had sung with the stone's hunger as though it were her own. And perhaps, at some level of her being that she did not fully understand even now, it was. The overseers came on the sixth day and looked at her with something that might have been pity. One of them, older than the others, a woman with silver at her temples and eyes that had seen 100 similar experiments fail in 100 different ways, simply said, "It is working perfectly." The blade does not diminish with use, it strengthens. The wielder, of course, will not last long. It was stated as fact, neutral and almost kind in its directness, and something in that kindness was worse than any cruelty would have been. She was not being tortured. She was fulfilling her purpose. Later, when the Jedi found the records of this moment, they would frame it as tragedy, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of dark side experimentation, and in a way they would not be wrong. But there was another way of looking at it, one that the records struggled to articulate. She had made the blade alive by making it hers, and it was consuming her because that was what life costs. Every breath was a price paid to something that would outlive her. Every use of the Force, every moment the blade burned, was a day stolen from her future. And yet she could not put it down. Not because she was enslaved to it, though she was, but because in those days of dissolution, as her body burned away to feed the hunger she had awakened, the blade was still the only thing that had ever truly seen her. It saw her when no one else did. It sang to her when she was alone. And it was killing her as slowly and intimately as a lover might. By the seventh day, she could barely stand. The Sith Lord came to the chamber 3 days after the first ignition, and the slave could see immediately that something was wrong with him. A tightness in his face that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the kind of fury that lives beneath the skin, patient and poisonous, waiting for the moment it can emerge. She ran because there was nothing else to do, and the blade in her hand was heavier with each passing hour, though it weighed nothing at all. The temple behind her, The great obsidian structure that had contained her entire existence receded into the crimson dust of Korriban, and she did not look back, though part of her wanted to, the part of her that still remembered the stone's song as comfort rather than hunger. The Sith Lord's fury had been cold and absolute. She had felt it in the Force like a winter that did not warm, and she understood in that moment that what they had created together, the alchemists, the overseers herself, the crystal, was not what he had wanted, and that failure in the eyes of power meant only one thing: erasure. The blade at her side seemed to pulse against her hip, and she realized with a clarity that terrified her that it was not separate from her anymore, if it ever had been. The line between weapon and wielder had been erased the moment the light first bloomed. She made for the spaceport first, moving through the lower territories where slaves and stolen goods changed hands in the dark, knowing that anyone could be hunting her and that the temple's reach extended far, but not infinitely. A ship captain with grey eyes and the kind of weariness that comes from asking no questions took her to the outer rim for credits she had stolen from an overseer's quarters, and she watched Korriban shrink behind her as the hyperspace tunnel opened before her, and she wondered if she would ever feel solid ground again. The captain did not ask her name, and she did not offer it, but on the third night of the journey, when the stars stretched thin and lonely around them, he found her collapsed in the corridor, her skin burning with a fever that came from somewhere deeper than flesh. She could feel it now, the blades pull on her, a constant gentle drawing, like blood seeping from a wound that would not close. It was not painful exactly, but it was relentless, and with each moment it grew stronger while she grew thinner. The captain, that grey-eyed stranger, gave her water and space, and did not speak of it, and when he put her down on a moon whose name she never learned, one of 10,000 forgotten rocks in the outer rim, far from trade routes and the eyes of the powerful, he left her with 3 months of provisions and a modified shelter, and he did not ask her why the blade sang the way it did or why her hands were shaking as she held it. She understood then, in the way one understands something that has always been true and is only now becoming visible, that she was not fleeing the temple at all. She was fleeing the blade itself, and also she could never flee it, because the blade was fed by her, and she was fed by the blade in a circle that had no end and no mercy. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes to someone who understands they are running from something that lives inside them, and I think about her in those dark years often, because she must have felt it acutely. The moon she was left on had 3 settlements, small and scattered, communities of exiles and merchants and people who had learned not to ask about the past, and she kept to the edges of them, moving between abandoned structures, places where people had given up on trying. The blade grew luminous in the dark and beautiful in a way that made her weep, and with each day that passed, she felt herself becoming less, her reflection in the blade's light showing a woman with deeper eyes and sharper cheekbones, as if the stone was polishing her down to something essential and then polishing past that. She began to keep records, scratching notes into the metal of a salvaged data slate, documenting what was happening to her, the way the crystal drew from her, the patterns of the hunger, the price that kept compounding. She told herself she was doing it for knowledge, so that someday someone else might understand, might avoid this path. But she also knew, in the part of herself that was still clear, that she was writing a confession and an apology and a will all at once. Years moved past her like seasons she was no longer part of, and the blade grew more perfect with each one, its light more stable and pure, while her hands became translucent and her breath came shallow. And she understood with absolute clarity now that she had been chosen not to create something, but to feed it, to give her life to the stone in increments spread across suffering. Other Force-sensitive beings sometimes found their way to the moon, exiles like her, or refugees, or Jedi hunters seeking the margin worlds. And when they came near her, they all felt the same thing. The blade's song, a call that was not quite a threat and not quite an invitation, something that drew the Force itself toward it like light to a lens. She never let them close enough to touch it, though part of her wanted to transfer this burden to someone else, to finally rest. But she could not, because the blade would not let her, because the blade needed her specifically, her particular frequency in the Force, her willing surrender. There were nights when she thought of the alchemists who had made her, prepared her for this, and she found herself forgiving them, because they had been trying to solve an impossible equation with the tools of domination, not understanding that what the Sith always missed was the difference between forcing something to work and creating something that wanted to work. And there were other nights when she thought of the slave she had been before the crystal chose her, and she tried to explain to that younger self why the recognition of being seen was worth this price, and she could not find the words, because maybe it wasn't, and maybe the crystal had simply been hungry, and she had been too desperate to notice the difference between love and appetite. The records she kept became more precise, more careful, as if precision itself could be a form of meaning, could somehow redeem the fact of her slow dissolution. And she noted the blade's increasing stability, its growing hunger, the way it no longer needed to draw from her to sustain itself, only from the Force itself now, a door she had opened in her own chest that would never close. I think that must be the strangest loneliness of all, to know that you are becoming unnecessary to the thing that is killing you, that the process you are dying to create is perfecting itself past the need for your sacrifice. On the dark years, those years whose names I cannot quite find a grip on, suspended as they are between one era and another, she waited, and she recorded, and she slowly became something other than human, something caught between the living and the dissolved, a woman wearing out from the inside, while the blade she had bonded with grew ever sharper, ever more hungry, ever more perfectly, impossibly itself. On the planet Tithon, in the deep core where the Force runs wild and strange, the Jedi Order kept their temples and their balance, walking the narrow path between Ashlar and Bogan, light and dark, as the twin moons wheeled overhead. It was there, in the stone libraries beneath Akarkesh, that a Jedi scholar named Keyleth first encountered a fragmentary account of something that should not exist, a weapon that fed on the wielder rather than serving them, forged in the dark temples of a distant Sith civilization. He read the account 3 times, each time feeling something in the Force grow cold, as though the very stone around him recognized what those words described. The account was incomplete, written in a dialect so ancient that portions of it had become nearly unintelligible, but the central claim was unmistakable. Somewhere in the galaxy, Sith alchemists had created a blade that was alive, that hungered, that consumed the Force itself like a thirsty thing drinking blood. For weeks, Keyleth said nothing. He simply sat with what he had read, turning it over in his mind the way a person might turn a dark stone, waiting to understand what it meant. When he finally brought the account to the Council of Balance, the response was not skepticism, but something deeper, a kind of resonance, as though the Masters recognized in this ancient warning an echo of something they had long feared. There were whispers, it turned out, that had come down through the generations. Rumors of Sith experiments with kyber crystals that had gone wrong, weapons that had been sealed away, bloodline stories of Force users who had tried to bond with living stones and found themselves becoming fuel rather than wielders. The Masters listened, and then they made a decision that would shape the early Jedi Order for centuries to come. They would send out seekers. Not warriors, yet. The Order was still young, still learning its own nature, but scholars and sensitives trained to hunt for traces of this impossible weapon, to understand its nature, and if they found it, to ensure that no one, Sith or Jedi or otherwise, could ever wield it again. This was not yet a crusade in the military sense, but it was the birth of vigilance. The moment the young Jedi Order looked inward and recognized that they would need to stand against forces far older and far stranger than simple conquest. Keyleth himself led the first expedition, traveling to the Outer Rim with 3 companions, following fragments of old records toward the Sith territories that were only just beginning to coalesce into what would become the Sith Empire. What they found was not the weapon itself, but traces of its making. Ancient alchemical texts describing the ritual of living containment, references to a Force-sensitive bound to a kyber that would not submit to domination, accounts of a blade that ignited and then ceased to be spoken of, as though it had been erased from official record. They found also, in the ruins of what had been a laboratory of some kind, a chamber that smelled of copper and desperation, where kyber fragments lay scattered across stone, and the residue of dark side ritual still lingered in the force like a scar. And in that chamber, Keyleth felt something that changed him, a kind of reaching, a hunger that was not directed at him, but that he sensed all the same, as though the very air remembered what had been forged there. He understood then, standing in that empty room, that they had not found a weapon. They had found the ghost of a choice, the aftermath of a sacrifice that had been willing and terrible. When Keyleth returned to Tithon and reported his findings to the council, he said something that the masters never forgot. "We are not hunting a blade. We are hunting an idea, and ideas are far more dangerous than steel." Because what the early expeditions were beginning to understand, slowly and with great unease, was this: the Sith had not created a mere tool. They had created something that violated the fundamental law of the Force itself, a thing that consumed rather than harmonized, that hungered rather than served. And if it could be done once, it could be done again. The Jedi Order had walked a balance between light and dark for ages, treating them as equal poles of the same truth. But this weapon, this living, ravenous thing, suggested something more troubling, that there was a way to weaponize the Force itself, to warp it toward hunger and domination, to make of it not a tool but a mouth. The Masters convened in secret in the highest temple, in Keyleth, where the Knowledge Keepers held their oldest records, and they made a choice that would reverberate through the centuries. They would begin gathering every fragment of alchemical knowledge they could find, every text describing the bleeding of crystals, every account of dark side ritual, and they would preserve it, not to learn from it, they told themselves, but to ensure it could never be repeated. They created the first sealed vault beneath Akar Kesh, a place where dangerous knowledge would be kept behind locks that only the highest masters could open. And they began to refer to what they were doing, quietly and with a kind of grim acceptance, as the Watch, an eternal vigilance against the hunger they had discovered sleeping in the galaxy's past. Years passed, and the early Jedi Order evolved from the Jedi tradition, gradually leaving behind the philosophy of balance and embracing a path of light more directly, motivated in part by what they had learned about the depths to which the Force could be twisted. But the Watch remained, staffed by select scholars and warriors, tasked with hunting down fragments of Sith alchemy, securing alchemical texts, and most importantly, ensuring that if any weapon like the one they had glimpsed in the ruins ever surfaced again, the Jedi would be ready to face it. The irony, and I think about this often when considering this era, is that in trying to prevent the creation of a Force-devouring blade, the Jedi had begun to conceive of the lightsaber itself as a weapon that needed to be controlled, mastered, transformed into something that would not hunger but serve. They did not yet know it, but they were already beginning to reimagine what the Sith had forged by accident into something they believed they themselves had invented. The real corruption, perhaps, was not in what was made, but in the lie that would grow around it. And the hunger that had been born on Korriban, that desperate, reaching thing in the Force, was not destroyed by vigilance. It was only hidden, waiting, patient as stone, for the moment when someone would finally understand what it had cost to make it, and why that cost was a price the galaxy would pay for millennia to come. On a moon whose name has been lost to time, or perhaps was never recorded by anyone who mattered, a woman built a shelter from stone and salvage, and began the work of staying alive long enough to die properly. The blade had stopped trying to hide what it was doing to her by then, had moved beyond the courtesy of gentleness into something closer to honest hunger. Each time she ignited it, the light wavered like a creature breathing, and she felt the pull as clearly as she felt her own heartbeat, which is to say, as something fundamental, something that could not be separated from the act of living itself. She was perhaps 30 years old, though the mirror she had salvaged from the crash site told her something older looked back. The Sith had named her, once in the way a breeder names a prize animal, but she had let that name fall away somewhere over the outer rim. She called herself the Keeper now, which was what the crystal called her in the quiet moments when she held it and listened to what it sang. There was a dignity in that. She had decided, in choosing her own name at the end. The isolation was not as lonely as you might think, because she was never truly alone. The blade was always there, always singing, always hungry. I think that distinction matters. There is a difference between solitude and loneliness, and she inhabited something closer to the first, even as the second was happening to her body without her consent. On the clearer days, when the pain in her joints was something she could think around rather than something she was, she would sit in the thin sunlight and begin to write. She had found datapad components in the wreckage of the transport that had brought her here, and she had pieced them together with the kind of intuitive mechanical skill that came from a lifetime of Sith discipline and centuries of Kyber memory bleeding into her own hands. What she wrote was not a diary, though it read like one. It was a formula, but not the kind written in equations or ritual language. It was written in the grammar of lived experience, in the precise descriptions of what she had felt when the crystal first sang to her, what she had understood in the moment of bonding, what she now knew with terrible certainty about the nature of the blade and what it required. She described the crystal's call in meticulous detail, a resonance at the edges of the Force, not pulling inward toward hunger, but outward toward recognition. She wrote about the moment of fusion, how it had felt to surrender completely, how the distinction between herself and the stone had begun to blur at the edges. She documented the stages of the blade's development, how it had moved from the first wavering ignition to a weapon of terrible, focused purpose, each phase of its maturation marked by a corresponding diminishment in her own capacity for endurance. She measured her own decline with the cold precision the Sith had taught her, the loss of sensation in her fingers, the way her breath came shorter, the mathematical relationship between how long she could wield the blade and how many days of life that cost her. But she also wrote about what that cost meant, about the terrible elegance of the design, the way a living weapon could exist only because someone was willing to be its fuel, not in the way the Sith Master had intended, but in a way that was somehow more honest. I find myself thinking about this a lot, that she seemed to understand something the alchemists and the Master had missed, which was that a weapon born from willing sacrifice carries a different weight than one imposed through domination. She wrote about this not as philosophy, but as observation, the way one might document a natural phenomenon. She recorded the precise ritual of attunement, step by step, what words or intentions or simply silent presence had guided the crystal toward alignment with her own Force signature. She noted which minerals seemed to strengthen the stone, which meditations had deepened the bond, what mistakes the Sith had made in their earlier designs, all the incremental knowledge that had been paid for in generations of failure and now, finally, with her own body. She wrote about the hunger without judgment, describing it the way an anatomist might describe a circulatory system, as something neither good nor evil, simply true. The blade fed on the Force itself, on the wielder's connection to that living energy, and in feeding it grew sharper, faster, more perfectly attuned to its purpose. She understood now that the Sith Master had been wrong about what this meant. His rage had come from the belief that the blade was resisting him, failing to be enslaved. But what if, she wondered in one passage that her shaking hand could barely render legible, the blade was not resistant to being mastered, but incapable of it, because it was not a tool at all, but something closer to a living thing, something that could only exist in partnership with its wielder, not domination. The realization seemed to calm something in her, or perhaps it was simply that she was beyond panic by that point, that the acceptance had become easier than the struggle. She documented the formula for creating the Kyber bond itself, not in the language of Sith alchemy or dark side ritual, but in the language of permission, of listening, of allowing the stone to recognize you as worthy of merging with it. She understood now that the Sith had been trying to force what could only be achieved through surrender. She wrote about what would happen to someone else who tried to create another such blade following her instructions, And here her precision became almost tender, a woman's last care for someone she would never meet, a kindness paid forward into the future. She warned of the hunger, yes, but she also described how to survive it longer, how to pace the wielding, how to listen to the blade's song before igniting it so you might move together rather than be dragged behind. She wrote about what it was like to die slowly, to feel yourself being consumed not all at once, but in the increments of every use, every choice to ignite the blade despite knowing the cost. She seemed to have made peace with this, or something close to peace, a recognition that she had been willing, and the blade had not tricked her. Only the master had done the tricking, in promising her mastery when what he meant was fuel. In the end, the datapad she had filled contained not a blueprint for a weapon, but something stranger and more honest. A record of lived consequence, a woman's account of how it felt to birth something beautiful and terrible, and then spend years watching it consume her while understanding exactly why it had to, and why that made it no less beautiful or terrible. The keeper sealed the recordings in a protective casing she had fashioned from salvage and embedded it in the rock of the moon, where it would wait for someone with the capacity to understand what she had left behind. She did not know if anyone would ever find it, and on the clear nights, when the stars looked close enough to touch, she found she did not mind either way. The blade would outlive her by eons, would be discovered and feared and eventually forgotten and rediscovered again, would become the symbol of an order that believed they had invented it. But here, in this small shelter on this forgotten moon, the truth would be written and waiting, patient as stone. A Jedi scout named Vess, traveling the shipping lanes of the Outer Rim on routine survey, felt something break open in the Force on a nameless moon orbiting a dying star. Not an alarm, but a falling away, like a note finally released from a long-held breath. She descended through thin atmosphere and found a settlement long abandoned, structures of stone and salvage settling back into the rock from which they'd been carved, and in the deepest of them, a chamber sealed with what she recognized as old Sith work, the kind that leaves a particular coldness in the Force. The Maker was still there, though barely. A woman whose body had contracted to something almost skeletal, whose skin had taken on the faint, translucent quality of someone who had been burning from the inside for a very long time. What struck Vess most was not her dying, but the precision with which she had arranged everything around herself. Datapads in careful stacks, inscriptions carved into stone, and at the center of it all, a broken lightsaber laid out like a sacred thing, its blade dark, its hilt cracked and stained with something Vess could not immediately name. The woman's eyes opened as Vess approached, and in them was a clarity that seemed almost obscene in someone so close to death. No delirium, no mercy of a failing mind, but a terrible lucidity. Vess knelt, and the woman spoke, and what poured out of her was not the fractured account of a dying person, but the measured testimony of someone who had been waiting for precisely this moment across decades. She told Vess her name, Kaeldor, though she said it as though dredging it up from before the Sith had called her only by her purpose. She told her about the crystal, how it had sung to her when she was nothing, when the Sith Empire had broken her into pieces small enough to fit its designs, and how that song had been the first time anything had ever called her real. She explained the bonding with words Vess would later struggle to transcribe, because what Kaeldor described was not a ritual or a technique, but a love, a mutual seeing between a woman and a stone, each willing the other into being. And then she described the blade's first ignition, the moment of triumph that had felt like the opening of a door into a new kind of existence, and then immediately like the beginning of an ending. She talked about the hunger, how it had started as a gentle thing, almost tender, the blade drinking her essence like a lover taking sustenance, and how over the years it had become relentless, a wound that never closed because it was where the blade lived. The overseers had told her this was the design, the price of living containment, but Kaeldor spoke of realizing, slowly across years, that she had been willing, yes, but not fully knowing what she was willing into. There's a moment in her testimony, recorded in Vess's own account to the council, where she says, I was chosen as fuel, not as master, and I did not understand the difference until it was already burning. Kaeldor showed Vess the data pads, one by one, each meticulously documented in the hand of someone who had kept her mind sharp even as her body failed her. They contained the mechanics of the bond, how the Kyber's hunger could be neither dominated nor destroyed, only partnered with, only met with consent that was genuine and ongoing. They held her theory, worked out across years of isolation and dissolution, that the Sith Master's philosophy of domination had been, at its heart, a misunderstanding. The blade could not be enslaved because it was alive in a way that slavery could never touch. Vess asked her very gently whether the blade was still hungry, and Kaeldor smiled, a terrible, gentle smile, and said it no longer needed her. She explained that in recent years, the blade had begun to feed directly on the Force itself rather than on her diminishing life, and so her death, when it came, would be not the blade's final feast, but simply the cessation of a vessel that had already become unnecessary. Vess understood then that Kaeldor had been dying for a very long time, but that she had not been dying from the blade alone. She had been holding herself together through will and documentation, waiting for someone who might understand what she had made and what it had cost. She asked Kaeldor what should be done with the blade, with the records, with this knowledge that seemed to tear open everything the Jedi Order believed about the nature of lightsabers and their own place in history. Kaeldor's answer was simple. Tell them the truth if you have the courage, but if you don't, and I do not judge you if you don't, then at least preserve what I have written. Let the future decide what to do with a weapon born of love and hunger and a maker who was both. Vess sat with her through the final hours, watching the Force gather around this woman like a cloak being drawn close, and Kaeldor spoke of the crystal's song one final time, saying that in the silence that came at the end, she thought she could hear it still, not calling, not hungry, but simply present, as if it had always been part of the music of the universe, and she had simply been the instrument through which it spoke. When the Force finally claimed her, Vess felt it not as a death, but as a dissolving, a woman returning to something larger than herself, and she understood then that Kaeldor had not been lost to the blade. She had been transformed by it, and in being transformed, had become something the Sith Master could never have anticipated or controlled. Vess gathered the data pads and the broken saber and made her way back to her ship, carrying knowledge that would shake the foundations of the Order's understanding of itself and its most sacred symbol. She did not know, as she ascended through that thin atmosphere, that the choice before the Council would not be whether to embrace this truth, but whether they had the strength to bury it. In the High Council chamber atop the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, with the vast cityscape turning soft gold beneath them, the 12 members gathered in silence as Jedi Knight Vess laid the datapad on the crystalline table between them. What she had brought back from the Outer Rim was not a victory, not a discovery in the way the Order usually understood such things, but a question so fundamental that it seemed to crack the air in the chamber itself. The records were Sith in origin. That much was clear from their structure, their language, the way they had been encrypted and hidden. But they were not a battle strategy, not a ritual, not a trap. They were instead a testimony, the lived account of a Force-sensitive being named Kaeldor who had bound herself willingly to a Kyber crystal and felt it consume her from within, slowly, across decades, until there was nothing left to consume. Vess spoke carefully, choosing each word as though the weight of it mattered, which it did. The beings who had made this blade did not see it as a weapon to be dominated, but as a living thing to be partnered with, a creature born of consent and hunger. She described the moment of ignition, the wavering light, the way the blade had begun feeding on its maker's essence, as though that hunger were simply its nature, as natural to it as breathing. She explained that the Sith Master who had commissioned it had raged when he realized the blade could not be enslaved, that his philosophy of absolute dominion had failed. And then she told them what Kaeldor had said in her final moments, that the Master had been wrong, that the blade was not flawed because it would not obey, but because it had never been meant to. Around the table, the council members absorbed this in their own ways, some with anger, some with confusion, some with a kind of tired recognition that the universe had always been more complicated than the Order liked to admit. Grand Master Yoda, who had trained Jedi for more than 800 years and had seen empires rise and fall like tides, sat very still, his ancient eyes half closed. He said nothing at first, which was in itself a kind of speech. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of what it meant that the weapon the Jedi had believed they had invented, the tool of their philosophy and their righteousness, might actually have been born in a Sith laboratory, forged through sacrifice and dark magic, alive in ways that should not be possible. Mace Windu, the Council's master of lightsaber form, was the first to speak, and his voice carried the weight of someone whose entire understanding of their craft had been quietly overturned. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then every blade we have ever wielded carries the echo of that original sacrifice. We have been teaching our Jedi to bond with kyber crystals by instinct, by the Force's own guidance, without understanding that we were following a path laid by Sith alchemy, that our harmony with the crystals was perhaps not an innovation, but an inheritance we never knew we possessed." It was a terrible thought, that the Jedi had believed themselves the inventors of peace, the discoverers of a way to make the Force's light manifest in physical form, when in fact they had been perfecting, or perhaps merely imitating, something built on suffering. The debate that unfolded over the following hours moved through three distinct currents, each of them carrying a different kind of fear. Some council members argued for immediate destruction, that the records be burned, that Vess's testimony be sealed, that the blade itself be dismantled so completely that no one could ever study it again. This, they said, was the only way to protect the Order from the knowledge that it might be unknowingly channeling the dark side's own creations, the only way to preserve the spiritual purity of the Jedi path. Others advocated for study, that the records be analyzed in the deepest vaults of the archives, that the blade be examined, that the precise mechanics of kyber bonding be understood, the better to ensure that what had been corrupted in Sith hands could be purified in Jedi ones. "We must understand what we are wielding," they insisted, "or we run the risk of perpetuating errors we do not even know we are making." And then there were those, fewer quieter, but no less insistent, who said that the knowledge should be hidden, yes, but hidden carefully, preserved by the Order not for any intention to study it, but simply because destroying such knowledge was itself a kind of darkness, a denial of truth, a deliberate forgetting that would make them custodians of a lie. These three positions, destroy, study, hide, sat in the chamber like stones in still water, and the council moved among them in circles, unable to settle. Yoda listened to all of them, his ears swiveling slightly, his hands folded in his lap, and when at last he spoke, it was with the kind of weariness that comes not from age, but from understanding. He said that the Order faced a choice that had no good answer, only different kinds of cost, and that any path they chose would haunt them. To destroy the records was to deny reality, to make themselves liars, to place the Order's peace above the truth. To study them openly was to risk spreading knowledge of Sith alchemy within the temple itself, risking corrupting their own people, and to openly admit that their foundational weapon had dark origins was to shake the faith of every Jedi who had ever trusted that they walked a path of light. And to hide the knowledge was to create a secret, and secrets, Yoda knew, had a way of poisoning everything around them, of creating divisions between those who knew and those who did not, of making the Order less whole. After a long silence, the council voted, and the path they chose was a kind of compromise that satisfied no one and settled everything. The records would be preserved, but sealed in the deepest restricted chambers of the archives, accessible only to the highest members of the council, marked with warnings that to read them was to risk contamination by forbidden knowledge. The blade itself would be stored in the sealed vaults, its true origins never to be publicly acknowledged. The official history would be corrected only quietly, incrementally. The Jedi would teach that they had invented the lightsaber themselves, refined it through generations of learning, and the earlier accounts of Sith proto-sabers and primitive energy blades would become the only story told. Vess was instructed to speak of her discovery to no one, and the name Kaeldor was struck from the records, replaced with only a description. A Force-sensitive being, origin unknown, deceased. What the Council had decided, in the end, was to preserve the truth while denying it, to know the real history while teaching a false one, to become keepers of a secret that would define their order in ways they could not yet foresee. I find myself thinking about that decision often, because it was, in its way, a kind of mercy. It allowed the Jedi to continue their work without the crushing weight of that knowledge destroying their faith. But mercy and truth are not always compatible, and what the Council locked away that day was not merely a dangerous weapon and a forbidden history, but also the question that would echo through every generation that came after. How much of what we believe to be our own light is actually the light of something we do not understand, something born in darkness, something that feeds on us even as we feed it. The vault was sealed, the records placed within, and the High Council dispersed into the Jedi Temple's many corridors, each of them carrying, in their own way, the weight of the choice they had made and the lie they had agreed to tell. Over time, the silence becomes a kind of consensus, and a consensus becomes an official truth, and an official truth becomes something that feels like it has always been so. This is how false histories take root, not through a single proclamation, but through the quiet, good faith choices of people trying to protect something they love. The Jedi Council had voted to seal the archives, to keep Vess's records and Kaeldor's testimony locked away from all but the highest members, and in doing so, they had made a choice that would echo for 10,000 years. But a sealed record is not the same as an erased one, and the decision to hide the truth meant the truth had to be remembered at least, by those who guarded it. The problem, though, was that remembering alone cannot fight what people decide to believe. On Tithon, in the temples that had become the heart of the Jedi Order, a new generation began to assemble lightsabers, learning the sacred ritual of kyber crystal bonding, understanding it as a tradition that belonged to them alone. No master called them together and said, "This weapon is not ours. It was born in darkness, from a sacrifice we are not worthy to speak of." That would have been too direct, too honest in a way that might break what the Council was trying to build. Instead, the teaching was simply, the lightsaber is the signature of a Jedi, the crystallized expression of one's harmony with the Force. And if you repeat something often enough, in ceremony, in stone, in the training of children from their first days in the temple, it becomes true in a way that facts alone cannot challenge. The Sith, of course, knew better. Or more precisely, fragments of the Sith knew better, and those fragments were scattered across the Outer Rim, held in Sith holocrons that required a dark side resonance to open, preserved in alchemical records that the early Jedi hunters had failed to completely burn. There were Sith lords who could access those sealed holocrons, who read within them accounts of the first lightsabers making, accounts sometimes corrupted, sometimes grandiose, always carrying the memory of something the Jedi Council had decided to bury. But the Sith were not unified in the way the Jedi were, and their knowledge was not organized, was not taught with the kind of ritual consistency that turns history into dogma. A Sith Lord would learn, in their own rite of passage, that the lightsaber's origins lay in ancient alchemical work, in the domination of crystals through bleeding and ritual, and many of them chose to believe that this dominance was the whole story, that the blade existed to serve Sith power, just as it served Jedi harmony. Some whispers persisted, though, fragments of truth that could not quite be erased. There were Sith histories that spoke of the living blade, the weapon that fed on its wielder, the crystal that could not be enslaved, but only consented to. But who had time for an unwieldy truth like that? Easier, far easier, to assume that the ancient alchemists had simply been on the wrong path, that modern Sith had perfected what the ancients had bungled. Easier to believe that knowledge only moved forward, that each generation improved on the last, that history was a ladder you climbed rather than a weight you carried. And so the Sith holocrons sat in their vaults, and the sealed archives in the Jedi Temple sat in theirs, and two competing narratives began to harden into certainty on opposite sides of the galaxy. For the Jedi, the lightsaber became proof of their righteousness, their harmony with the Force, the physical manifestation of their Order's founding principles. Young Padawans learned to construct their sabers as a sacred rite, and the beauty of that rite, the meditation, the bonding with a kyber crystal that revealed its true color only when touched by a Jedi's light, made it feel true in a way that historical facts could never quite match. When you build something with your own hands, when you feel the crystal's warmth respond to your presence, when you ignite a blade that has revealed its blue or green heart only to you, it becomes difficult to imagine that someone else forged it first, that your beautiful ceremony is a kind of inherited mask. The Sith, meanwhile, preserved a half-truth that was almost more dangerous. They believed they had invented the blade too, or at least perfected it, shaping it into a weapon of dominance and hunger through the bleeding of crystals, the corruption of kyber into red rage. Some Sith knew there were older accounts in the holocrons, histories that spoke of something else entirely, of a weapon born not from dominance, but from willing surrender, from a bond that was love before it was hunger. But those accounts were fragmented, sometimes contradictory, sometimes so metaphorically obscured by ancient writers that their meaning had become opaque. And when a half-truth contradicts a well-beloved certainty, the half-truth tends to dissolve. What remained, across both traditions, was a kind of agreed-upon forgetting. The Jedi taught their younglings that the lightsaber was born from their Order's harmony with the Force, that the weapon reflected the wielder's inner light. The Sith taught that domination created power, that a blade bent to the will of its maker was the only blade worth wielding. Neither side spoke much of Kaeldor, the dying woman on a remote moon in the Outer Rim, who had loved a crystal and let it consume her so that something new could exist. Her name was not forbidden, it was simply absent. And there is a particular cruelty in that kind of absence, because it allows people to believe they are being honest, that they are simply telling the story that matters, that some lives and some sacrifices are just too small or too strange to be worth remembering. I think about what it must have meant to the council members who read her testimony, who understood what she had given, who chose to seal that knowledge away. Yoda, who would have felt the weight of it most acutely, would have known that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for your people is to let them not carry an impossible truth. But he would also have known that there is a cost to that kindness, that the sealed knowledge becomes a kind of poison, slowly working into the Order from within. And so the story settles into place, not as a lie told once and then forgotten, but as a truth rehearsed so gently and so often that it becomes indistinguishable from the air you breathe. The lightsaber is the Jedi's weapon. The lightsaber was born from domination. Both stories, held in suspension, neither one complete, both of them missing the woman whose love and sacrifice had made them possible. Kaeldor's name would pass from living memory into the sealed vaults, and then into archives so restricted that only a handful of Jedi in any given age would know to look for it. But she was there in the archives, waiting, her testimony preserved, her records intact, her name sealed away like a kind of oath that one day someone might read the truth and have to decide whether to carry it or keep hiding it. The choice had been made. Preservation through silence, truth through denying it, history made safe by making it disappear. And the lightsaber burned on in the hands of Jedi and Sith alike, neither side quite knowing, or perhaps both sides knowing too well, that every ignition was an echo of a woman's willing death, a crystal's hunger, and the question of what we owe to the things we make when those things cost us everything. There is a particular kind of hunger that grows in the dark, in archives and sealed vaults, among those who remember only fragments of what came before. Centuries had passed since Kaeldor's body was found, since the Jedi Council made its careful choice to hide the truth about the first lightsaber in sealed records, accessible only to the High Council itself. But on Korriban, in the Obsidian laboratories deep beneath the Valley of the Dark Lords, a different kind of remembering was taking place. The Sith had not forgotten the old alchemy, the disciplines passed down through apprentice to master across generations of practitioners, each generation believing itself the inheritor of some ancient perfection. What they possessed were fragments, datapad entries recovered from ruined sites, corrupted holocron recordings that played back in pieces, contradictory accounts preserved in the pyramidal crystalline vaults that only the dark side could unlock. Some spoke of a weapon that had fed on its wielder. Others described a blade of impossible instability that had burned with wavering light. A few whispered of a ritual that had gone catastrophically wrong. The pieces did not fit together, and so each Sith Lord who studied them felt free to imagine how they should. In that silence, where the true story had been buried, 100 false stories took root. A young alchemist named Vexil. It is worth naming her, because she believed herself to be rediscovering something lost, not creating something new, stood in the laboratory where the original Kyber experiments had been conducted, and she saw in the fragmentary records not failure but potential. The old Sith had been trying to bleed the crystals into submission, to dominate them through ritual and will, to force the stone into slavery to a Sith Lord's vision. But what if the problem was not domination, but design? What if a Kyber crystal, properly understood, could be made to hunger deliberately, to feed on the Force in a controlled way, to become a weapon that grew stronger the more it was wielded? Vexil assembled a team of alchemists, younger practitioners, most of them hungry for achievement, eager to restore the Sith's alchemical legacy to what they imagined it had once been. They did not have Kaeldor's records. The Jedi had sealed those away, and the Sith had not thought to preserve them. They had only the broken pieces, the contradictions, the gaps that could be filled with ambition. They began to synthesize, not in the old way, which would have required a living host and raised uncomfortable questions about sacrifice that did not fit Sith philosophy, but through a new understanding of Kyber cultivation. Using techniques drawn from their knowledge of Sith alchemy, of the dark side disciplines that could corrupt and shape, they attempted to grow synthetic crystals from raw Kyber rough, seeding them in alchemical baths infused with dark side power, with the rage and will of the Sith themselves. The crystals that grew in these baths were unstable, prone to fracturing, difficult to focus into a blade. But some of them, a very few, produced blades that seemed to possess something like appetite, a quality that made the weapon feel alive in a way that standard lightsabers did not. Vexil called these success. Her peers called them dangerous. And they were, but in a way that the Sith philosophy could almost romanticize, could almost reframe as power. A blade that hungered was, they told themselves, a blade that wanted to be wielded, that demanded mastery and strength from its user. If the wielder grew tired, if the user began to fail, well, then the blade would claim them, and a stronger successor would take up the weapon, would achieve what the weak could not. In this way, they convinced themselves that what they were recreating was not a mistake, not the desperate sacrifice of a woman named Kaeldor who had bonded herself to a stone and slowly died, feeding it her essence. They convinced themselves they were perfecting it. What they did not know, what they could not have known, because the Jedi had locked away the only account that mattered, was that they were not inventing anything new. They were circling around the memory of something real, something that had happened once before, something that had cost a life they would never know. Centuries of the gap had become a blank space where meaning could be poured in, where each new generation of practitioners could impose its own understanding on the silence. Vexil's synthetic crystals did produce blades, and some of them did seem to possess a kind of hunger, and some of the Sith Lords who wielded them did find themselves drawn deeper into the dark side, did feel their power growing even as they grew weaker, did eventually burn out like stars consuming themselves from the inside. The Sith alchemists interpreted this as triumph. Here was proof that the old techniques were being recovered, refined, perfected. Here was the path to power that the ancient Sith had discovered. Here was the engine of dominance that would fuel their restoration. I find myself thinking a great deal about what Kaeldor would have made of this, had she somehow been able to witness it across the centuries. Her true gift, and it was a gift despite everything it cost her, had been consent, understanding, the wisdom to know that the Kyber could not be enslaved, but only partnered with. That willing sacrifice was different from unwilling servitude, that there was something almost holy in the surrender that allowed two beings to become one. The Sith who came after her, working from broken pieces and their own hunger for power, had learned none of this. They had learned only that Kyber crystals could be made to feed, that such feeding could be harnessed, that the cost, paid by the wielder, paid in suffering, paid in slow dissolution, was acceptable if it resulted in a weapon. They had learned the mechanics of her sacrifice without understanding its meaning. And in learning only the shadow of what had been, they set in motion something that would echo forward through the next age, through the next 100 years, through all the generations of Sith Lords who would believe themselves the keepers of ancient power and never know that they were holding only the broken half of a story. But that is still ahead of us. For now, understand that on Korriban, in the sealed laboratories where the first blade had been born, a new generation was at work, believing themselves discoverers when they were truly echoing an echo, practicing a ritual whose original meaning had been buried so completely that only those who had sealed the records away, and even then, only a handful of Jedi, would ever know what had truly been lost. Centuries passed, and on Korriban the fragments of the original design multiplied like a dark seed, taking root through generations of soil. What survived in the sealed holocrons were not Kaeldor's careful, heartbroken journals, but corrupted echoes, incomplete records, contradictory diagrams, fevered dreams of mastery mistaken for blueprints. A Sith Lord here and there glimpsed something in the old texts about a blade that fed on its wielder, about a crystal that demanded surrender rather than domination, and they read it backwards as confirmation of their own hunger for power. The young alchemist Vexil was among them, brilliant, ambitious, convinced that the Sith of old had glimpsed a terrible perfection that later generations had merely forgotten how to complete. What she did not know, could not know, was that she was circling the echo of a sacrifice, learning only the mechanics of hunger without understanding the love that had given the weapon its true nature. She studied the fragmentary accounts in the deepest vaults, cross-referencing broken holocrons with half-remembered ritual sequences, and she began to synthesize. Here a bleeding technique, there a crystalline matrix, everywhere the assumption that the original makers had simply not been dark enough, not ambitious enough, not willing to pay the necessary price. And so the Sith began, in earnest, to rebuild. Across the temple laboratories, the work accelerated, not as careful scholarship, but as competition, as each dark lord and ambitious artificer sought to perfect what they believed to be ancient glory. There is something I find myself thinking about when I consider this era. The way a lie, once it has taken root, generates its own terrible momentum. The Sith believed they were reclaiming lost wisdom. The Jedi believed they had invented something new. Both were wrong in different ways, and because both were wrong, both doubled down. Masters took apprentices to sealed chambers and handed them the recovered designs, speaking in hushed, reverent tones about blades that hunted, weapons that evolved, the living edge of Sith perfection finally being restored. The apprentices, understanding only that they were being given ancient knowledge and a promise of power, did not question whether the records made sense. Why would they? They came from the Sith Lords themselves. The first time a young Sith warrior ignited one of these new designs, the blade ignited in a burst of red light, not the wavering, unstable glow that had marked Kaeldor's creation, but a fierce, stable red that burned with apparent hunger. It felt alive in the wielder's hand, as if the blade itself were reaching out into the Force, drawing power not just from the crystals, but from the very bonds of the dark side itself. The wielder's masters watched, nodded, and called it a triumph of recovered technique. What they did not notice, not yet, was the subtle wrongness. The way the wielder aged slightly faster after each practice session, the way repeated ignitions left them drained in ways their predecessors had not been, the way the blade seemed to demand more and more of them with each use. When these symptoms appeared, they were interpreted as signs of the weapon's efficacy, of its power, not as warnings. A Sith Lord who felt his vitality drain after wielding his blade simply believed he had found a weapon worthy of the cost, that this was the signature of true power, that sacrifice was the price of mastery. And so the designs proliferated. Across Korriban, across Zeost, across every Sith stronghold in the Outer Rim, the red blades multiplied. Each one was slightly different, tweaked and refined by the alchemist who had perfected it. Each Dark Lord convinced their variation was the truest version of what the ancients had intended. The early designs were crude, the power systems unstable, the blades prone to overheating during prolonged combat, the cycling field energizers prone to failure under the stress of the dark side coursing through them. The first generation of these weapons, in truth, were not so different from the ancient proto-sabers, tethered to external power packs by cables, burning hot, dangerous as much to the wielder as to their enemies. But the Sith did not see this as a problem to be solved. They saw it as confirmation of authenticity. If the blades burned hot, it was because they were hungry. If the wielders grew weary, it was because they had found a weapon that demanded their full commitment. If the systems failed during battle, it was because the dark side's power could not be fully contained by mortal hands. And was this not the mark of something ancient and terrible? There were deaths, of course. Young Sith Lords who pushed the designs too hard and burned out utterly, their connection to the Force severed or worse, leaving them hollow shells that the Order discarded without much ceremony. But in an empire built on the understanding that the strong survived and the weak fell away, these deaths were not anomalies to be studied. They were simply the price of power, and power was all that mattered. I think about what Kaeldor would have made of this, if she had somehow been able to witness it across the vast gulf of centuries that separated her death from their work. She had bonded with her crystal in an act of love and willing surrender, had felt it feed on her while she fed it her consent, and had eventually understood that the hunger could not be separated from the gift. The Sith Lords of this age were attempting to harness that hunger without any of that understanding, to weaponize it, to make it serve their will. But hunger, once alive, does not serve. It only takes. The Sith had inherited the mechanisms of the first blade, but not its philosophy, if philosophy is even the word for what Kaeldor had lived through. They had inherited the hunger, but lost the consent. And so every blade they forged in this era became, in some sense, a repetition of her sacrifice, a cycle of willing or unwilling dissolution, energy drained, lives shortened, all in service to a vision of power that was not power at all but merely hunger mistaken for mastery. What made this tragedy particular was that no one knew they were repeating a tragedy. To the Sith Lords wielding these blades, they were living in an age of restoration, of regained glory. To the Jedi, watching from across the galaxy with growing alarm, the Sith seemed to be developing new and more terrible weapons, proving their own righteousness in contrast. Only in the sealed archives on Coruscant, in a single encrypted datapad, and the memories of 3 High Council members who had read Kaeldor's words, was the truth preserved. But this was not restoration or innovation, but recurrence, the same terrible equation being solved again and again, without any of the people involved understanding what the original solution had cost. And the question that haunts that era, I find, is whether knowing would have changed anything at all. Would the Sith have stopped? Would they have chosen differently? Or is there something in the very nature of power in the hunger for it, in the willingness to pay any price, that makes such knowledge impossible to hear until it is far too late. The 1,000 blades burned on, red and hungry, each one a small, incomplete echo of a woman who had loved her blade and paid for that love with everything she was. What comes next in the story is perhaps the most fragile and human part of it, the moment when the Jedi, unknowingly standing on the edge of a chasm they did not understand, began to ask a very dangerous question. What if there was another way? In this age, the Age of the Republic, as the historians call it, the lightsaber became something the galaxy had never seen before. Not a weapon of dark necessity, but a symbol of law itself. On Coruscant, in the gleaming Jedi temple that rose like a beacon above the Senate district, the lightsaber was taught as the defining tool of the Jedi Order, inseparable from what it meant to be a guardian of peace. Young Padawans gathered in the training halls and spoke of the gathering, the rite of passage where they would travel to the ice caves of Ilum and find a kyber crystal that called to them, claiming it as their own. There is something profound in that ritual, I think. The idea that a weapon should choose you as much as you choose it, that there should be consent between wielder and blade. What these younglings did not know, what most Jedi did not know, was that this beautiful rite had been carefully constructed to conceal a far older, far darker truth. In the archives beneath the temple, in chambers accessible only to the High Council and a select few senior masters, Vess's records of Kaeldor lay sealed behind layers of security that had become less about protection and more about forgetting. The Jedi had made a choice, in the years after Vess returned from the Outer Rim, with testimony that shook the foundations of everything they believed about themselves. Grand Master Yoda, in his vast and patient wisdom, had guided them toward a path that was neither wholly truth nor wholly deception, but something more complicated, a knowing denial that would outlast the Republic itself. They chose to hide the records, yes, but not to destroy them, to preserve Kaeldor's name and a sacrifice in sealed archives, where future generations of the highest council members might someday know what had really happened. But they also chose to teach a different history, that the Jedi had invented the lightsaber, refined it, perfected it, that it was a Jedi weapon born from Jedi wisdom and Jedi restraint. And here is the strange thing about that lie. By the time of the Republic's height, it had become so embedded in ritual and teaching, so woven into the fabric of Jedi identity, that it felt like truth. When a Padawan constructed their first blade in the forges beneath the temple, they were not simply building a weapon. They were performing an act of Jedi creation, repeating a foundational myth that told them who they were. The ritual itself, the careful selection of components, the meditation with the kyber crystal, the moment of ignition, all of it became a kind of prayer, a way of saying, "This is our tradition, this is our invention, this is what makes us Jedi." And in that sense, perhaps, they did invent it anew with each generation. Even though the blade they held was born from a sacrifice they did not remember making. The lightsaber became elegant. Obi-Wan would later call it that, an elegant weapon for a more civilized age, because the Jedi had learned, whether they knew it or not, to build weapons that did not hunger, that served rather than consumed. In the hidden chambers of the archives, the artificers who studied Kaeldor's records and the captured Sith blades began their quiet work of refinement and understanding. They learned things the Sith had never quite grasped, that kyber crystals were not tools to be dominated through rage and ritual, but living things that could be harmed and healed. They discovered that a crystal corrupted by dark side bleeding could be restored if listened to carefully, if approached with patience rather than force, if treated as a partner in creation rather than as property to be enslaved. The first healed blades ignited in shades of white, pure, clean light, free of the wavering hunger that had haunted the original. And when these crystalline teachers learned to work with the deeper nature of kyber beneath the corruption, the blades began to settle into soft blues and greens. These discoveries remained sealed away, taught only to the artificers and the council, held as a kind of secret knowledge that the Outer Order did not need to know. And so the Republic Age developed its peculiar structure. Two teachings of the lightsaber existing in the same institution, unknown to one another, like water flowing in two channels without ever meeting. The public teaching was beautiful and noble. The lightsaber as a symbol of justice, of discipline, of a Jedi's commitment to serve the Republic and protect its people. When the Jedi were dispatched to mediate disputes across the galaxy, when they walked the corridors of power with their blades at their sides, the lightsaber was understood as a badge of office, proof of their authority and their right to wield it. The blade became law in a very real sense, not because the Jedi imposed it through violence, but because its presence meant, here stands someone trained to use this justly, someone committed to restraint and wisdom. For 1,000 years, the Sith were believed to be extinct, and this absence meant the Jedi had no rival, no shadow self to remind them of what their weapon had originally cost. The records of the living lightsaber, of Kaeldor's sacrifice, of the hunger that had been corrupted into a weapon, these things faded not into prohibition, but into the softer erasure of simple irrelevance. Jocasta knew, the chief librarian, kept the archives in meticulous order, and she knew where Vess's records were kept. But she also understood that some knowledge was not meant for general inquiry, not forbidden, but protected behind layers of clearance and tradition. I find myself thinking a great deal about what it means to build a society on a truth that is deliberately hidden, even from most of those living within it. The Jedi were not corrupt, nor were they being dishonest in any simple sense. They were being practical, trying to preserve an institution that served the galaxy well while carrying in their foundations a wound they did not wish to examine. But a wound that is not examined festers, and the lie, no matter how well-intentioned, carries its own weight, its own hunger, its own slow poison. In the restricted vaults of the archives, Kaeldor's records sat in darkness, containing a truth that the lightsaber's public legend had erased, that the weapon had been born from love as much as hunger, from a woman's willing sacrifice, from consent given in darkness by a slave who had finally been seen as real. And the blades that the Jedi built, elegant, harmonious, perfect in their way, these blades did not carry the memory of that sacrifice, but they carried its echo. Every blue blade and green blade that ignited in the hands of a Jedi carried within it, unknowingly, the shape of a different blade that had burned in different light, in a woman's hands, on a moon no one remembered, in a time that had been deliberately forgotten. There is something in that, the way the past reaches forward through sealed archives and hidden knowledge, the way a single choice made by the Council at one moment in history ripples outward, shaping centuries, shaping the stories people tell themselves about who they are and what they have made. The lightsaber became law not because the Jedi imposed it, but because they believed in what they had been taught to believe, that they were worthy of wielding it, that it was theirs to bear, that they had invented it themselves in the image of their own virtue. And the most dangerous lie is always the one that contains just enough truth to feel true, the one that is protected not by denial, but by the simple, overwhelming weight of ritual and time, and the human desire to believe in one's own goodness. In the age of the Republic, the lightsaber stood as a symbol of justice, because the Jedi were, by most measures, just. But they carried that justice balanced atop a sealed truth, and they did not know it, or perhaps they knew and had chosen not to know, which is the same thing in the end. In the last quiet years before everything collapsed, when the Republic still held its shape and the Jedi Temple still felt like home, something strange began to happen in the archives. A handful of scholars, the kind who lived among the data stacks and could recite the genealogy of knowledge the way other people might name their own children, started noticing small inconsistencies in the foundational records. These were not historians looking for drama. They were meticulous people, the sort Jocasta knew trusted absolutely, and what they were finding troubled them precisely because it was small. The official histories taught that the first lightsabers emerged from Jedi innovation, a natural refinement of earlier energy weapon designs, perfected on Ilum by the Ancient Order as it developed its understanding of kyber crystals. But scattered throughout the archives were older references, fragments really, that seemed to describe something else entirely. Weapons that predated the Jedi, born in different places, under different circumstances, carrying a hunger that innovation alone could not explain. One scholar, whose name is worth saying because she came to understand something true in those final days before the temple fell, was named Ilara Ven, a woman in her middle years who had spent 20 of them cataloging the restricted holocron vault. Ven began to notice gaps, and more troubling still, she began to notice where the gaps had been deliberately filled. Certain sequences of Jedi Masters seemed to skip generations without explanation. Others appeared in restricted records, but were absent from the public genealogies, as if someone had decided they were inconvenient to the narrative. She found references to a project called the Watch, established in the earliest days of the Jedi Order, tasked with hunting and sealing Sith alchemy, a project whose existence contradicted the teaching that the Jedi had discovered the lightsaber through peaceful study. If they had been hunting Sith weapons from the beginning, it meant they had known there were Sith weapons to hunt. It meant they had known the Sith had made them first. What Ven found, carefully documented in her private research, was a pattern of deliberate omission. Not lies exactly, but a kind of architectural silence, where certain truths had been carefully removed from the official teaching while still preserved in sealed sections, known only to the highest members of the council. She brought her findings to Jocasta Nu, because Nu was the chief librarian, and because Ven believed in the old motto, "If it is not in our records, it does not exist." But what if, Ven asked quietly, what if something had been deliberately removed from our records? What if the absence itself was the proof of something we had been taught to ignore? Jocasta Nu was not an unkind woman, and she was brilliant in her way, but she was also deeply bound to the doctrine of the Order, the belief that Jedi teaching was complete, that the highest council members knew what needed to be known, and that questioning the foundations of the institution was a path that led only to confusion and doubt. She told Ven gently but firmly that some records were sealed for good reason, that not every scholar was meant to understand everything, and that Ven's role was to preserve and organize the archives as they had been given to her, not to interrogate their construction. But Ven could not let it go, not out of ambition, but out of a kind of spiritual vertigo that comes when you realize the ground beneath your feet may have been built on a lie, even a well-intentioned one. She began to ask other scholars quietly. Had they noticed inconsistencies in the timeline of the lightsaber's development? Had anyone else found references to crystal bonding that did not match the official accounts? Had anyone else wondered why the earliest Jedi writings about kyber crystals spoke of partnership and healing, while the later, more authoritative texts spoke only of mastery and attunement? A handful of others had noticed, she discovered, but they had learned to live with the contradiction, or to assume that the older writings were simply less refined in their understanding. What Ven understood, sitting alone in the deep archives on the night before the Clone Wars would finally consume the temple, was that the Order had made a choice, long ago, to believe in its own story. And that choice had seemed like wisdom at the time, perhaps, to take a history complicated by suffering and redeem it through claiming it as their own foundation, to transform a tragedy into a triumph. But lies have weight, even the kindest ones, and they settle into the foundations of institutions like stones with fault lines. They make the structure beautiful from the outside, while weakening it from within. The Jedi Order in those final years was not corrupt, but it was fragile in ways it did not understand, brittle with certainty, unable to imagine that the weapon it had carried with such pride for thousands of years might carry a secret wound. Ven documented what she had found in a private encrypted file, not to expose the council or betray the Order, but because she believed that truth, even uncomfortable truth, was worth preserving. She never intended to reveal it. She simply knew, in the way that certain people know such things, that the day might come when the Order would need to understand what it had built its authority upon. She could not have known that day would come so soon, or in such darkness, or that the archives themselves would be set aflame by the very Order that had sealed the knowledge within them. But she was right to save what she had found, because some truths are meant to survive their institutions, meant to wait in silence until the moment when someone is finally ready to hear them. That moment would not come for many years, and it would come to someone grieving, searching through ruins, desperate for meaning in the ashes. But it would come. In those last quiet years before the temple fell, Ilara Ven walked the archives, carrying the weight of knowledge she could not speak, and she understood something that the highest council had not yet learned, that sealing away the truth does not protect the Order, it only delays the moment when the truth must finally be reckoned with. And when that moment comes, it comes in a form you cannot control. Before the Clone Wars took the temple, before the fall was even a whisper in the corridors, there was a Jedi librarian named Ilara Ven who asked a question that should never have been asked, not because the answer was hidden, but because the hiding itself had become sacred. Ilara had spent 23 years in the archives on Coruscant, moving between the glowing blue holobook spires that held the Order's collective memory, cataloging, cross-referencing, understanding the shape of Jedi history, the way an archaeologist understands the bones of a city. She was not a warrior, and the Order did not particularly value that. Librarians were keepers, not makers of legend, and so she had always worked in a kind of beautiful quiet, noticed by almost no one. But quietness teaches you to listen, and Ilara had learned to hear the silences between the records as clearly as the words written in them. She was searching the oldest sections one afternoon, the ones few Jedi ever reached, deep in the archives where the spires seemed to glow a little dimmer, as if the knowledge there had been left undisturbed so long it had begun to fade, when she found the first inconsistency. The official history of the lightsaber, the one taught in the temple, the one woven into the Padawan's initiation right at Ilum where they harvested Kyber crystals, said the Jedi had invented the blade, had discovered the harmony between wielder and crystal, had refined it across millennia until it became the perfect expression of their philosophy. But when Ilara traced backwards through the oldest records, following the lineage of design, she found gaps. Not absences, which are clean and tell you nothing, but deliberate interruptions, places where the chronology simply skipped forward, where references to earlier work had been carefully, almost surgically removed. There was a record of Jedi Master Vess, mentioned only in passing, in a context that made no sense without previous material that had been sealed. There was a reference to sealed testimony from the Outer Rim recovery, which appeared nowhere else in the archives. There were design sketches for early lightsabers that looked nothing like the ceremonial weapons Jedi built now, crude, asymmetrical, with notations about instability and unsustainable bonding. And in one fragmentary note in a hand she did not recognize, the phrase, "The cost to the wielder cannot be measured." Ilara sat very still in the dimness of the old section and felt the first small cold touch of something that was not quite fear, not quite certainty, the feeling of having glimpsed something that someone very powerful had decided the Order should not look at directly. She brought her findings to Jocasta, new one morning, moving quietly through the corridors of the temple as the light from Coruscant's cityscape filtered through the high windows. Jocasta knew was chief librarian, a woman of precise movements and sharper precision of mind, and she had served the archives with an almost religious devotion for decades. Ilara had always found her fair, if distant, the kind of administrator who understood that knowledge was both sacred and dangerous in equal measure. When Ilara showed her the gaps and the inconsistencies, the way the lightsaber's origin seemed to double back on itself and refuse a clear beginning, she watched Jocasta's expression shift from interest to something harder, something like protective caution. There are reasons the oldest records are sealed, Jocasta said quietly, which was not an answer to the question Ilara had asked. What reasons? Ilara said, because she was brave in the small, persistent way of scholars. Jocasta stood and moved to one of the great crystalline spires, her hand resting on its glowing surface, and when she spoke, her voice had taken on a weariness that Ilara had never heard before. The Jedi Order is built on certain understandings, she said, on foundational truths that give meaning to everything else we do. Some of those truths are older than others. Some of those truths are complicated in ways that might complicate the faith of those who depend on them. But the truth shouldn't be complicated by, Ilara began, and Jocasta turned to face her, and there was something in her eyes that made Ilara stop. Shouldn't it? Jocasta said, and there was neither anger nor judgment in her voice, only a kind of sad recognition. The truth is always complicated, child. The Jedi are not. And in times like these, when the dark side presses against us, when our sight grows clouded and we cannot feel clearly in the Force, the last thing the Order needs is to lose faith in the very symbol of its purpose. And Ilara understood then, with the sick clarity of someone who has suddenly seen the shape of a secret, that Jocasta was not telling her this information was false or forbidden or dangerous. She was telling her that it was true, and that the truth had been deliberately preserved in the vault of sealed knowledge, and that the Order had chosen to teach a different story instead. If an item does not appear in our records, it does not exist, Jocasta said, and it was not the statement of a rule. It was the statement of someone who had lived by that rule and understood its cost. That principle has guided the archives for generations, but the deeper truth is this. Sometimes we choose what does not appear, and sometimes that choice is made in love, not in deception. Ilara left the archives that day and did not return for a week, and when she did, she moved with purpose through the corridors to the restricted sections, to places she had never been granted access, and she began to document what she had learned, copying references, cross-checking inconsistencies, building her own hidden record of a hidden history. She worked in fragments, in the spaces between her official duties, because she understood now that she could not ask permission to know what the Council believed she should not know. She did not do this in anger at Jocasta or the Order, though she should have felt anger. Instead, she felt something closer to pity and responsibility in equal measure. The temple was already changing, subtly, with news of conflict on distant worlds, with whispers of the Sith returning, with a heaviness in the air that even the youngest Padawans could sense, a feeling that the light was dimming, that something was coming. And Ilara thought of all the young Jedi who walked through the archives and learned the false history and built their faith upon it. And she understood that the sealed knowledge, Kaeldor's name, the testimony of sacrifice, the understanding that the lightsaber was born not from Jedi mastery, but from a love and hunger that no one had ever fully reconciled. That knowledge needed to survive the coming darkness. So she planted it carefully, like seeds in soil that might not be fertile for years or centuries, embedding her documentation in the archives themselves, in places only a scholar patient enough to truly listen to the silences would ever find. She could not undo the false history the Council had chosen, but she could ensure that the truth, if anyone was ever brave enough or desperate enough to seek it, would still be there to be found. And she waited in the quiet of the archives for whatever would come next, understanding, in that moment before the war, before the temple fell, that sometimes bearing witness to a hidden truth is its own form of faith, separate from and stranger than any institutional belief. The light of the holobook spires glowed steady and blue around her, as it had for generations, holding everything the Order had chosen to remember and everything it had chosen to forget. In the wreckage of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, among the scorched stone and the silence that follows slaughter, a figure moves through the rubble with the careful steps of someone who still expects the ground to give way beneath them. The temple had been a place of light. That is how the Jedi described it, and they meant it not metaphorically, but as a literal truth, the marble and crystal designed to catch and refract the Force until the whole structure seemed to hum with harmony. Now it was ash and shadow, and the ash was still warm. This particular Jed, and I should tell you that his name matters less than what he is about to find, so we will call him what the records called him, a fallen one, had been away when the clones turned, away when the Order came through, away when his brothers and sisters died in the halls where he had learned to meditate. He had been away, and he had lived, and he had come back looking for something, a record, a proof, a reason to believe that what he had been taught was not built on a foundation of lies. He did not know yet that he was looking for Kaeldor. Deep in the temple's lower vaults, where the Jedi archives were kept sealed behind locks, both physical and metaphysical, he found something that should not have survived the fire. A chamber, unmarked and hidden, where light did not quite reach, and the air tasted of preservation spells laid down thousands of years before. Inside was a kyber crystal. It was broken, fractured down its length like a thing that had been struck from within, and it was dark, not black, but a terrible absence of color, as if the light had been burned out of it long ago and never come back. But it was alive. He felt it the moment his hand came close. A hunger that was not aggressive, but not gentle either. A pull that wanted something from him, the way a wound wants to be tended, the way a voice that has been silent for 1,000 years wants to be heard. The fallen Jedi was trained in force sensitivity, trained to listen to kyber crystals and hear their songs, but he had never felt anything like this. The resonance was not a call but a question, and it carried in its depths something that felt very much like recognition. When he touched the broken crystal, the memories came not as visions, but as understanding, the kind of knowing that bypasses the eyes and goes straight into the bones. He saw a woman in shadow, kneeling in a chamber where light was forbidden to enter, her hand on a stone that sang to her in a voice only she could hear. He saw her choose to bond with it, not because she was forced, but because to be chosen by it felt like the first time in her life she had ever mattered. He saw the moment the blade ignited, that terrible, beautiful moment when light bloomed from her own life force, when she became the weapon and the weapon became her, and he felt, as she felt, the first gentle tug of the hunger that would never stop. He understood through the crystal's memory that her name had been Kaeldor, and that she was the one the archives had been hiding, the original, the first, the foundation that the Jedi had built over in marble and false doctrine. The fallen Jedi should have recoiled from this knowledge. He should have destroyed the crystal, sealed it away, preserved the comfortable lie that the Jedi had chosen to believe for millennia, that their lightsabers were born from light and harmony, not from the sacrifice of a slave who heard a kyber's song and answered it. But he had just watched his order fall. He had watched the temple burn and the children die, and the false certainty that had held his faith collapse into ash and blood. He had nothing left to protect by denying the truth. The hunger in the crystal was familiar to him now because he recognized it in himself. The hunger to know, to understand, to be seen for what he truly was rather than what he had been told to be. He knelt there in the darkness of the vault and held the broken crystal in both hands, and he let the memories come, thousands of years of them, bleeding through the fractures in the stone like light through cracks. He felt Kaeldor's love for the crystal that had loved her first. He felt her slow dissolution as the blade grew stronger, the way her body had paid the price for something beautiful and terrible. He felt her understanding in the end that she had not been a master but fuel, and that her choice to be fuel was the thing that gave the weapon its nature, not hunger born of domination, but hunger born of willing union, which was somehow worse because it could not be condemned as purely evil, only as sad, infinitely sad, the cost of creation paid in a single life. He felt something else too, deeper in the crystal's memory. The moment when a Jedi named Vess had found Kaeldor dying on a distant moon and had carried her testimony back to the temple and had placed it in the hands of the Council, knowing that the Council would choose to hide it. The fallen Jedi understood then that the lie had been a choice, not an accident. The Jedi had known the truth and had decided that the truth was less important than the certainty of their faith. And that understanding, perhaps more than anything else, broke something in him that had been holding together by habit alone. He sat in the vault with the broken crystal in his hands and wept, not for the temple or the order or even for himself, but for Kaeldor, whose sacrifice had been so complete that she had been erased not by her enemies, but by those who called themselves her heirs. The crystal hummed in his hands, and he felt its hunger reach out across the millennia and find something in him that matched it, not a willingness to bond, but a willingness to remember, to be the vessel that held her story when every official record had decided to forget it. Outside the vault, the Empire was consolidating its power, beginning the work of erasing the Jedi from history entirely. But in the darkness beneath the temple, a fallen Jedi and a broken crystal shared a moment of communion that felt, to both of them, like the first true meeting either had ever known. And I find myself thinking about this often, that sometimes the most dangerous truths are not the ones that are forbidden, but the ones that survive because someone decides they matter more than comfort. There is something in that. The blade remembers, even when the Jedi who made it are gone. The past reaches out across time not to haunt us, but to ask us a simple, unbearable question. What are we willing to know about the things we have built our lives upon? Tonight, I want to talk about why the first lightsaber still burns, not in the chambers where it was forged, not in any Sith vault or Jedi archive, but in every blade that has been ignited since, in the hands of every wielder who has ever felt the crystal, recognized them through the Force. Because the truth that the Jedi Council sealed away on Coruscant did not stay sealed. It leaked out into the design itself, into the very physics of what a lightsaber is and what it costs to make one real. You see, when the Jedi artificers, those quiet scholars working in the hidden depths of the archives, began to study Kaeldor's records and the hunger that lived in her blade, they made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about kyber crystals. They found that the instability in the first lightsaber had not come from insufficient Sith domination, as the dark side had always believed, but from something the Sith could never have understood. That you cannot feed a living thing into permanent submission through rage and ritual. That you can only ever corrupt it, break it, turn its nature inward until it consumes itself and whatever holds it. So the Jedi took a different path, not because they were wiser, but because they were willing to listen to what Kaeldor had learned across her slow dissolution. That a kyber crystal was not a tool to be conquered or bled, but a voice to be heard. They learned to approach the stone with patience and gentleness, to sense not what they wanted the crystal to be, but what it was trying to become. And in doing so, they discovered how to heal what had been broken, to help a kyber remember its own nature, before corruption twisted it into hunger. The blades they began to create in secret were softer somehow, less sharp with rage, glowing with the blue and green light that would eventually define the Jedi as the galaxy came to know them. But, and this is the part that matters, they did not invent this knowledge. They inherited it from the woman they were taught had never existed, whose sacrifice they were forbidden to speak of, whose willing choice to bond with the crystal had been rewritten as a Jedi invention that came much later. So when every young Jedi through the ages went to Ilum and gathered a kyber crystal and performed the ritual, they were not creating something new. They were refining something born from Sith suffering and Jedi refusal to acknowledge it. There is a weight in that, a strange and heavy thing. The lightsaber became the symbol of justice and peace in the Republic, and it was. But it was also a monument to a lie that the Jedi had chosen to tell about themselves, that they had woven so thoroughly into ritual and teaching that the lie became indistinguishable from faith. I think that is why the first blade still burns in every blade that follows. Not because Kaeldor's hungry crystal reached forward through time. It did not. It was sealed away in darkness. But because the question it asked could not be sealed away. The question being, what are we willing to sacrifice to make ourselves powerful, and what lies do we tell ourselves about the cost when we have made the sacrifice? For the Sith, the answer was simple. Power justified anything, cost was irrelevant, the wielder was only fuel, and their dissolution was triumph. For the Jedi, the answer was more complicated, because they said no. No, you cannot build justice on suffering you refuse to acknowledge. And then they went ahead and built it anyway, just on top of sealed records instead of screams in a chamber. They refined the blade, yes. They learned to listen to the crystal instead of breaking it, and that mattered, that changed what the weapon could become. But they never answered the deeper question that Keldor left for them. Whether a tool born from living sacrifice can ever be truly free of that origin. Whether every time you ignite the blade, you are not in some way continuing her death. The Jedi artificers in the archives knew this, I think. At least some of them knew it, and lived with it quietly, carrying both the false history and the true one in their hands when they worked on the crystals. Ilara Ven certainly knew it, near the end, when she planted the knowledge through the archives like seeds before everything burned. And the fallen Jedi who found the broken crystal in the temple's ruins knew it too, because he could feel Keldor's presence in the stone itself, her willingness and her slow dissolution, the terrible clarity of her understanding that she was never a master, but always only fuel. So here is what I want you to understand. The reason the first lightsaber still burns is not because the truth was successfully hidden. It is because the truth was sealed, but never actually answered. It remains, in the design of every blade that exists, as a question that every wielder carries without knowing it. Every Jedi who ignites their saber does so on top of a woman's sacrifice and a council's deliberate silence about it. Every Sith who bleeds a crystal into red fury does so without knowing that the hunger they are invoking is not the sign of power they believe it is, but the echo of a failure they have been circling for millennia. The blade that was built from consent and love and the breaking of that consent, it changed what lightsabers could be, but it could not escape the fundamental fact of its own origin. Neither could the Jedi, no matter how much they refined the design or how deep they buried Keldor's name. And so every lightsaber that has burned since carries in it both possibilities. The possibility of healing, of listening, of approaching power with gentleness, and the possibility of corruption, of hunger, of building monuments to justice on top of sealed suffering. The first blade did not end when Keldor died. It ended when the Jedi Council sealed her records away and chose to call their refinement of her sacrifice their own invention. But in ending, it did not disappear. It scattered itself into the millions of lightsabers that will be built across the ages, not as a curse, but as a warning. Every time a blade is ignited, there is a moment where both possibilities exist. The possibility that this will be a weapon wielded with awareness of what it cost to create, with humility about the sacrifice underneath it, with a real understanding that power and suffering are not separate things. Or the possibility that the wielder will ignite the blade without ever knowing or asking what it was built upon, and will go on repeating the same choice the Jedi made, the choice to accept power while refusing its cost. I do not know which possibility any single lightsaber will embody when it is ignited. But I know that both live in it, because both lived in the first one, and the first one lives in all of them. That is why it still burns, in the archives that sealed it away, in the ruined temple where its broken crystal was found, in the hands of every Jedi and Sith who will ever hold a lightsaber and wonder, for just a moment, what they are really holding when they hold a blade. So the story does not end, you see. It just becomes very quiet, very patient, very much like the way the Force itself waits to be heard by those who finally decide to listen. And somewhere in that patience, Keldor's sacrifice endures, not as triumph and not as tragedy, but as a truth that burns underneath everything that comes after it, asking without words, what will you do with what was given at such cost?